The room was quiet in the way only hospital rooms can be. Not peaceful, not calm, just waiting. A steady beep echoed from a monitor beside the bed, each sound marking time slipping away. The kind of sound you notice only when you know it might stop at any moment. Outside the window, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the floor. Inside, a family stood frozen between what had already happened and what could never be undone. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And then, according to those who claim they were there, a voice broke the silence. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. What if the person who never held the knife was the one who made everything inevitable? That question sits at the heart of this story. A story that many believe they already understand. A story that headlines rush to simplify. A story where one man was arrested, charged, and publicly condemned within hours. Case closed. Or so it seemed. But what if the truth didn't begin at the crime scene? What if it began years earlier, in whispered conversations, subtle encouragements, emotional nudges disguised as concern? What if the most devastating act in this family's history was not the violence itself, but the slow psychological pressure that came before it? And what if the last confession didn't come from the accused, but from someone no one suspected? This is not a courtroom verdict. This is not a police report. This is a reconstruction of alleged accounts, disputed memories, and a confession that surfaced only when it was too late to change anything. Because when the Reiners were found dead in their Brentwood estate, stabbed, their lives violently cut short, the world immediately focused on one name. Nick Reiner, 32 years old, living in the guest house, arrested the same night. Charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. To the public, the story made sense almost instantly. The troubled son, the isolated guest house, the proximity, the motive everyone assumed existed even before it was proven. It fit the narrative people are comfortable with. But families are never that simple. Behind the gated walls of that $13.5 million estate lived years of resentment, unspoken rivalry, emotional debts, and a complicated dynamic that outsiders rarely see. And within that dynamic was someone whose role would later be whispered about in hushed tones. Someone whose guilt, if it exists, cannot be measured in fingerprints or DNA. Someone who, according to alleged accounts, waited until a hospital deathbed to say what they had carried for years. "I was the one who pushed him." Those words, alleged, unverified, and fiercely contested, would never make it into an official report. No detective wrote them down. No prosecutor presented them to a jury. No journalist could fully confirm them. But that doesn't mean they didn't change everything for the people who heard them. Ask yourself this. If someone emotionally pressures another person into believing violence is justified, who is really responsible? That question is uncomfortable. It forces us to confront a reality we prefer to ignore. Because it's easier to believe monsters act alone. It's easier to believe guilt belongs to the person who commits the act, not the one who quietly encourages it. But this story refuses to be that clean. To understand what allegedly happened in that hospital room, we need to rewind long before the night of the murders, long before police sirens, long before headlines. Back to a family that looked perfect from the outside and fractured from the inside. The Reiner family name carried weight, success, influence. The kind of legacy that shields problems from public view. To neighbors and colleagues, this was a family that had everything: money, status, opportunity, security. But inside the house, there were lines drawn long before blood ever touched the floor. Adoption complicated those lines, not because love was absent, but because comparison is relentless. In families, biology often creates invisible hierarchies. Who belongs naturally? Who has to earn their place? Who feels secure? Who feels replaceable? Tracy Reiner grew up carrying a last name that opened doors while quietly reminding her she was not born into it. Adopted into privilege. Welcomed, yet always aware of the unspoken difference. Not an outsider, but never entirely inside either. Some say that kind of upbringing creates gratitude. Others say it creates pressure. And some say it creates resentment that never fully disappears. What happens when love and obligation collide? When gratitude coexists with anger? When someone believes they owe everything to a family, yet also believes that family owes them something in return? Those tensions don't explode overnight. They simmer. They evolve. They turn into conversations that sound harmless at first. Conversations that feel like venting, like bonding, like shared understanding, until they're not. Nick Reiner was, by many accounts, struggling. Emotionally, mentally, possibly financially, possibly existentially. Living steps away from his parents, yet worlds apart from them. Close enough to feel controlled, far enough to feel abandoned. And when someone is isolated, validation becomes powerful. Who listens to them matters. Who agrees with them matters even more. Psychologists will tell you that influence doesn't require commands. It doesn't require instructions. All it takes is repeated affirmation that someone's anger is justified, that their pain is real, that their resentment makes sense, that the people they're angry at are the source of everything wrong in their life. At some point, a line is crossed, but no one can agree on when that line was crossed in this family. Police focused on actions. Journalists focused on timelines. The public focused on Nick. Very few people asked who was talking to him in the months before everything collapsed. And fewer still asked why certain conversations were never recorded, never documented, never discussed publicly. Then came the discovery. The bodies were found on a Sunday. The cause of death later described as multiple sharp force injuries. The manner of death listed as homicide. The date of death, which had been speculated about online, officially recorded. Romy Reiner, the daughter who reportedly discovered the bodies, made the call that set everything in motion. According to reports, she mentioned a dangerous family member, a phrase that immediately drew attention, a phrase that seemed to point in only one direction. But language matters. Why say dangerous family member instead of a name? Why frame it as suspicion rather than certainty? And why did that phrasing later haunt people who replayed the call in their minds? The arrest came swiftly. The public sighed with grim relief. A suspect, a face, a narrative. The machinery of justice moved forward. But families don't stop existing when police take over. They grieve. They fracture. They blame. They reassess years of interactions through a new lens. And sometimes, in the quiet aftermath, someone realizes they played a role they never intended to acknowledge. Fast forward to the hospital room. The air was heavy with things unsaid, with regrets that could no longer be fixed, with apologies that came too late to matter. And according to alleged accounts that cannot be fully verified but refuse to disappear, someone spoke. Not to the police, not to the media, but to family. A confession that didn't describe violence, but influence. A confession that didn't claim action, but responsibility. A confession that suggested the real crime might have been psychological. I was the one who pushed him. If those words were truly spoken, what do they mean? Were they an expression of guilt? A metaphor? A desperate attempt to rewrite history? Or a moment of clarity that arrived only when there was nothing left to protect? And if they were never meant for the world to hear, why did they eventually leak? This story matters now because narratives harden quickly. Once the public decides who is guilty, nuance becomes inconvenient. But nuance is where the truth often hides. This is not about excusing violence. This is not about rewriting charges. This is about understanding how families create pressure cookers that eventually explode. Because if influence can destroy lives without ever leaving physical evidence, then justice becomes far more complicated than we want it to be. And as we move deeper into this story, one question will follow us relentlessly. If someone plants the idea, who is really guilty? Because the next chapter doesn't begin with the murders. It begins with a family portrait that hid more cracks than anyone was willing to admit. And what came next would change everything. Long before anyone realized a confession would one day surface on a deathbed. From the outside, the Reiner family looked like the embodiment of success. A sprawling Brentwood estate, manicured gardens, polished smiles for the cameras. The kind of family that made people glance at their own lives and feel a twinge of envy. To neighbors, colleagues, and even casual observers, they had everything: wealth, influence, opportunity, and the kind of stability most people only dream about. But appearances are a fragile thing. One glance at a family photograph, a passing comment during dinner, or a subtle tension in a handshake can tell a very different story. And in the Reiner household, the story behind the facade was far darker than anyone imagined. It's easy to assume that murder springs from nowhere, that it comes out of a vacuum. But no crime is entirely spontaneous. They are often the culmination of years, decades even, of hidden resentments, unspoken rivalries, and quiet battles fought behind closed doors. In this family, those battles began long before Nick Reiner ever picked up a knife. Tracy Reiner, the adopted daughter, often felt this tension without fully understanding it. Being adopted into a family of high achievers is not simply about love. It comes with invisible expectations, unspoken comparisons, and the pressure to prove that your place in the family is earned, not given. Tracy's last name opened doors. It gave her access to a legacy. But it also marked her as someone who had to work twice as hard to be seen as equally worthy. Some would call it privilege. She might have called it a gilded cage. And then there were the siblings. Romy, the youngest, just 27 when the tragedy struck, was often described as quiet, reserved, but fiercely loyal to her parents. And Nick, 32, lived in the guest house just steps away from the main house, a separate building that physically represented the emotional distance he felt from his family. In that distance, emotions festered. Anger, frustration, confusion, all silently accumulating like water behind a dam. From the outside, the Reiners maintained the illusion of harmony. Family photos on social media depicted smiling faces at holiday gatherings. Public appearances showcased cohesion and mutual respect. Interviews highlighted shared values, supportive parents, and children who seemed to thrive. But anyone who has ever lived within a family knows that appearances are not reality. A smile can mask fear. A polite conversation can hide resentment. And a quiet house can echo with secrets that no one dares speak aloud. In this household, there was a subtle hierarchy that dictated everything. Who got attention, whose accomplishments were celebrated, whose missteps were quietly ignored, and whose mistakes became lessons for everyone else. In families with wealth and reputation, mistakes are rarely allowed to stay private. They are magnified, internalized, and often weaponized. Nick's place in that hierarchy was complicated. He was close enough to be expected to follow in his parents' footsteps, but far enough away to be constantly compared and found wanting. Isolation in the guest house may have been intended as comfort, a private space for a grown child, but for Nick, it became a crucible. Alone with his thoughts, with the family expectations echoing across the lawn, he was vulnerable to influence in ways that no one in the public eye could understand. And that influence, according to alleged accounts, came from Tracy, the adopted daughter, who may have carried her own resentments, saw opportunities where others saw loyalty. Behind closed doors, words were exchanged, words that might have seemed casual, supportive, or even caring, but allegedly planted seeds of doubt, anger, and justification. It is said that she reminded him repeatedly of injustices he had suffered, real or imagined, and subtly framed his resentment as righteous. The house itself mirrored the family's fractured dynamic. The main estate, grand and imposing, represented control, authority, and the world's gaze. The guest house, tucked away in the rear, represented separation, marginalization, and the unspoken distance between Nick and his parents. In that small, secluded building, emotions could fester without interference. Conversations could occur without witnesses. Ideas could take root and grow unchecked. What begins as a whisper can become a roar when no one is there to challenge it. Family psychology experts often note that manipulation doesn't need to be overt. It doesn't require shouting, threats, or visible coercion. All it takes is repeated affirmation that someone's negative emotions are justified, that their anger is righteous, and that action, even violent action, is the natural culmination of years of neglect, criticism, or isolation. Within the Reiner household, these dynamics were complicated by wealth and privilege. With money comes access, and with access comes opportunity. It is easy to forget that behind every luxury, every polished surface, every carefully curated appearance, there are human beings, humans with vulnerabilities, insecurities, and impulses that money cannot protect against. Privilege does not inoculate a family against resentment. Often, it amplifies it. Yet despite these cracks, the family still presented a united front to outsiders. For years, they maintained the facade. They hosted gatherings. They smiled for photos. They carried themselves as a model family, admired and envied in equal measure. This duality, the polished exterior versus the turbulent interior, is a hallmark of many tragic stories. The more perfect the exterior seems, the more explosive the interior pressure becomes when finally released. Tracy, as the adopted daughter, understood both sides. She understood what it meant to belong superficially while feeling emotionally marginal. She understood the silent rules of the household, the subtle expectations, and the ways influence could be wielded quietly but powerfully. And if her alleged confession is to be believed, she also understood how to nudge, prod, and manipulate those already on the edge. The tension that eventually erupted into violence was not a sudden anomaly. It was decades in the making. Every word, every glance, every perceived slight contributed. The murders of Reiner and Michelle were the tragic and irreversible manifestation of years of unspoken dynamics, internalized resentments, and emotional manipulation. To see them as isolated acts of violence is to misunderstand the story entirely. And yet, the public narrative was already moving in a different direction. Nick Reiner, the son living in the guest house, became the face of blame. Headlines were written. News cycles consumed the story. Social media opinions proliferated. In the court of public opinion, guilt had already been assigned. But the deeper, more insidious questions about influence, responsibility, and unspoken coercion were ignored. They existed only in whispered conversations among those willing to acknowledge that family violence is rarely simple. What is even more chilling is that according to reports, the first cracks in the family narrative didn't come from the crime scene, the police investigation, or the media. They came from within, from those who were closest to the family, who saw what outsiders could not, those who understood that influence, once planted, can grow into something uncontrollable, those who understood that a whispered nudge can be as powerful as a physical act. And that whisper, if true, eventually became a voice. A confession allegedly made on a deathbed. A voice that claimed responsibility not for wielding a knife, but for influencing the hand that did. A voice that changed the way we must interpret every event leading up to that tragic Sunday. A voice that forced the world to reconsider what guilt really means in a family torn apart by resentment, privilege, and secrets. Because the Reiner family was never truly perfect. That perfection was a mask. Behind it lay competition, jealousy, marginalization, and subtle psychological warfare, all of which culminated in an act so devastating that it could never be undone. And in the aftermath, when the public focused solely on Nick, the more complex, troubling questions of influence and responsibility remained unspoken, hidden behind the curtains of grief and disbelief. As we continue this story, it is crucial to remember, families like the Reiners are not unique in their fractures. Many families experience unspoken rivalries, hidden resentments, and subtle manipulations. But few are wealthy, high-profile, and tragically public in their collapse. That visibility amplifies every secret, every whisper, and every conflict, making it almost impossible for the truth to remain contained. So as we move forward, consider this. What you see on the surface is never the full story. Every smile hides a calculation. Every word carries weight. Every silence can be a choice. And in this family, every choice mattered. Because the night the Reiners were murdered, the culmination of decades of hidden tension, influence, and resentment became undeniable. The deathbed confession allegedly made by Tracy Reiner was not just an isolated revelation. It was the climax of a story that had been building silently for years, a story of love, obligation, jealousy, manipulation, and ultimately, tragedy. And what comes next will reveal the dynamics behind the family that the world only thought it knew. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Being part of a family is complicated enough. Being adopted into a family with influence, wealth, and a public image to maintain, that's an entirely different universe. Tracy Reiner's life was defined by this tension. She carried the Reiner name with pride, but that same name was a constant reminder that she had not been born into it. Privilege, opportunity, and recognition came with a subtle, unspoken cost, the need to prove she belonged. Tracy's early years were marked by this duality. On the surface, she was accepted, embraced, even celebrated. Her parents provided everything a child could want: education, travel, cultural exposure, financial security, but the undercurrent of comparison was always there. Every achievement, every success, was silently weighed against those of her biological siblings. Was she as good? Was she as natural? Did she fit seamlessly into the family's identity? These questions weren't always asked aloud, but Tracy felt them with every interaction. Psychologists refer to this as latent marginalization, when someone feels included but never entirely internalizes belonging. The love is there, but so is the quiet insecurity that comes from always needing to validate oneself. And this wasn't just a minor pressure. In the Reiner household, where image mattered as much as personal connection, every action was scrutinized. Every choice carried consequences, whether intended or not. For Tracy, this meant that her successes were never fully hers. They were always measured against the standard of being good enough for the Reiner name. And any perceived failure, however small, carried the weight of disappointment. A weight that she learned to internalize rather than express openly. Growing up, Tracy learned to navigate this delicate balance. She became adept at reading the room, understanding unspoken rules, and maneuvering within the constraints of expectation. Some might call it skillful diplomacy. Others might see it as subtle manipulation, the ability to influence outcomes while remaining ostensibly neutral. Over time, Tracy developed a keen understanding of how words, gestures, and timing could shape the thoughts and actions of those around her. This skill would later become critically important. As the family dynamics shifted, as tensions simmered between siblings, and as Nick Reiner grew more isolated in the guest house, Tracy's understanding of influence became a tool, allegedly used in ways that would have devastating consequences. It's essential to note that Tracy's position as an adopted child gave her a unique perspective. Unlike biological siblings, she was both inside and outside the family simultaneously. She understood the inner workings of the household, yet she could maintain a certain detachment. This detachment allowed her to see opportunities, to recognize fractures that others overlooked, and, according to alleged accounts, to subtly guide events in directions that suited her perceptions of justice, fairness, or, perhaps, retribution. Some psychologists argue that adoptive children in high-pressure households often develop what is known as strategic empathy, the ability to sense and predict others' emotional responses and use that knowledge to navigate social situations. In Tracy's case, this strategic empathy may have become a double-edged sword. It allowed her to survive and thrive within a complex family hierarchy, but it also placed her in a position where her influence could have unintended consequences. The tension between belonging and autonomy is central to understanding Tracy's alleged role in the events leading up to the murders. On one hand, she was loyal to her parents, deeply aware of the importance of family reputation, and invested in maintaining the outward appearance of cohesion. On the other hand, she was acutely aware of slights, real or imagined, and the disparities in how different family members were treated. This dual awareness created a psychological landscape in which her words and actions carried disproportionate weight. According to alleged accounts, Tracy's interactions with Nick were subtle but persistent. Conversations that seemed casual on the surface may have contained undercurrents of influence. Statements meant to encourage or validate could also reinforce resentment and anger. Words like, "you've been treated unfairly," or "they don't understand you," are deceptively simple, but when repeated, they can shift perception, alter judgment, and, in extreme cases, push someone toward drastic actions. It's crucial to understand that influence is rarely obvious. It doesn't need to be overt or confrontational. In many tragic cases, the person exerting influence may never touch the weapon or even suggest a specific plan. All that is required is repetition, affirmation, and the creation of an emotional environment in which extreme decisions feel justified. Allegedly, Tracy Reiner occupied exactly this role in her interactions with Nick. Her position as an adopted child also added layers of complexity to her alleged involvement. She had lived with the unspoken knowledge that her family might never fully see her as one of their own. That knowledge can generate subtle feelings of resentment, even in the most loving households. Some experts argue that this kind of emotional history can manifest as a desire to assert control, to correct perceived injustices, or, in extreme cases, to direct the actions of others in ways that settle old scores. Over the years, Tracy reportedly cultivated a relationship with Nick that was both protective and influential. She offered guidance, support, and understanding, but always in a way that reinforced his grievances rather than alleviating them. Allegedly, she reminded him of the inequalities he perceived, subtly framing them as intentional slights or systemic injustice. And in doing so, she may have contributed to a mental framework in which violence became a conceivable outlet for frustration and anger. It's important to clarify that none of this is officially verified. These are alleged accounts, reconstructed from testimonies, whispers, and claims made after the tragedy. But even allegations can illuminate how emotional dynamics within a family create conditions for extreme outcomes. They reveal the mechanisms by which one individual's words, repeated over time, can carry as much weight as any direct action. Beyond her influence on Nick, Tracy's own emotional experience adds another layer of complexity. Being both loved and perpetually measured, she may have internalized a mixture of loyalty, resentment, and frustration. These emotions, combined with her ability to read and influence others, created a potent psychological cocktail. Her alleged deathbed confession, "I was the one who pushed him," can be interpreted as an acknowledgement of this invisible power. It was a statement not of physical action, but of emotional causation. And that causation is far more difficult to quantify than the act of stabbing. Legal systems rely on evidence, fingerprints, DNA, eyewitness accounts. Emotional influence leaves no tangible trace. It resides in the space between intention and action, in the invisible threads that connect human behavior over time. Understanding Tracy's alleged role requires acknowledging that some forms of guilt are psychological, not physical, and that they may be as consequential as any overt crime. Throughout all this, the family's public image remained intact until the murders. The world outside the Reiner estate never saw the tension, the subtle manipulations, or the quiet resentments that had been simmering for years. And in that disconnect between appearance and reality lies a crucial truth about human behavior. The things people hide, deny, or rationalize often carry the most power. Tracy Reiner's story, as alleged, is a study in duality. She was at once loyal and resentful, supportive and influential, visible and marginal. Her words may have guided, shaped, or even escalated a tragedy, yet she herself was a product of the same pressures and comparisons that affected every member of her family. This duality, both victim and vector, is central to understanding the complexity of the events that would later unfold. By examining her role, we confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility. How much of human action is determined by internal desire, and how much by external influence? Can someone be morally accountable for the decisions of another if they have shaped the emotional landscape in which those decisions are made? Tracy's alleged confession suggests that she believed her influence was significant and perhaps catastrophic. As we move deeper into this story, it becomes clear that her role cannot be separated from the broader family dynamic. The Reiner household, with its wealth, status, and public image, created conditions in which hidden tensions could grow unchecked. Tracy's unique position as both insider and outsider gave her insight and influence that may have been more powerful than anyone realized, until it was too late. And so, the stage was set. A family torn by hidden resentments. A son isolated and vulnerable. An adopted daughter whose subtle influence allegedly nudged events toward disaster. And a tragedy that would shatter the veneer of perfection. But what came next would test the limits of family loyalty, trust, and moral responsibility, and no one could have predicted how far the consequences would reach. Nick Reiner, 32 years old, the son who lived in the guest house, separated physically and, as alleged by those close to the family, emotionally from the main household. To outsiders, he was simply another member of a wealthy, high-profile family. An adult son living near his parents, with all the privileges and comforts that money could buy. But to those who knew him, Nick was far more complicated. From a young age, Nick displayed a sensitivity and intensity that made him both endearing and, at times, difficult to understand. He was bright, perceptive, and capable, but he also struggled with the pressures inherent in a family like the Reiners. Success was expected, obedience implied, and emotional expression sometimes misinterpreted as weakness. In a household where perfection was admired and flaws quietly noted, Nick found himself constantly measured against standards he could never quite meet. As he grew older, the pressure intensified. Parents, siblings, and extended family all had expectations, subtle or overt, about how he should behave, succeed, and interact. Living in the guest house, a structure meant to provide autonomy, ironically amplified his isolation. While he was physically near the family, he was socially and emotionally distant. The house's separation created a psychological barrier, a space where Nick was alone with his thoughts, insecurities, and grievances. And those grievances, according to alleged accounts, were not insignificant. Nick reportedly felt misunderstood, unappreciated, and, at times, controlled by the very people who should have been his closest allies. Emotional neglect, whether perceived or real, can fester in ways that are invisible to the public. A casual observer sees a well-off, adult son. A family member might see a simmering frustration that grows with each subtle slight, every overlooked achievement, every quiet reprimand. Isolation has a way of magnifying internal struggles. Nick's time in the guest house may have been intended as independence, but it also created a pressure cooker of loneliness and vulnerability. He was close enough to the family to know he was being judged, yet far enough away to feel powerless to affect change. In this environment, any external influence, positive or negative, could have outsized impact. Allegedly, this is where Tracy's influence became critical. Words of validation, encouragement, or grievance from someone who understood both him and the family dynamic reportedly carried enormous weight. According to those who have spoken after the tragedy, Nick's emotional state was fragile. He was grappling with feelings of anger, frustration, and helplessness, emotions that, unchecked, can be corrosive. He reportedly confided in few people, seeking understanding from those who he believed could see the injustice of his situation. And when someone like Tracy, a sibling with insight into the household dynamics, offered repeated affirmation, it may have reinforced his grievances, framing them not as personal struggles, but as systemic wrongs that demanded action. It's critical to note that while Nick's isolation and emotional struggles were real, the question of agency remains central. Could he have acted differently? Did he have other outlets, support systems, or interventions that might have prevented tragedy? These are questions that haunt every case where familial pressure, influence, and mental fragility intersect. The answers are rarely simple, because human behavior is rarely linear. Emotions, circumstance, and influence interact in unpredictable ways. Nick's vulnerability was compounded by his parents' position in the family hierarchy. They were authoritative figures, widely respected and influential both publicly and privately. Their expectations were clear, and any deviation could be met with disappointment or subtle criticism. To someone like Nick, already feeling marginalized, these dynamics may have felt oppressive. Living nearby yet emotionally distant, he experienced a form of containment that is difficult to describe to outsiders, but familiar to those who have ever felt trapped within the invisible walls of family expectation. Isolation alone, however, does not cause violence. What allegedly tipped the balance was a combination of sustained emotional influence and the reinforcement of grievances. Conversations, remarks, and subtle suggestions reportedly compounded over time, shaping Nick's perceptions and potentially his decisions. Allegedly, Tracy's guidance, her words of understanding, validation, and encouragement, may have acted as a catalyst, framing his anger as justified and, perhaps, inevitable. But even as the alleged influence grew, Nick was not entirely passive. Reports describe moments of uncertainty, hesitation, and internal conflict. He reportedly struggled with the morality of his feelings, aware, at least in part, of the consequences of his imagined actions. The internal struggle between loyalty, fear, and resentment is a hallmark of family tragedies. It illustrates that even when influence is present, the individual's agency, while compromised, is not completely absent. Nick's life in the guest house was also shaped by external pressures. Friends, acquaintances, and extended family all had expectations. Social media, professional networks, and public perception added layers of stress, making privacy and emotional processing difficult. In an environment where every move can be observed and interpreted, mental strain can intensify, particularly when compounded by existing familial tensions. It is also important to consider the psychological impact of repeated affirmation of grievance. When someone repeatedly hears that their anger is justified, that the injustices they perceive are real, and that others are actively conspiring against them, it can create a cognitive loop. Thoughts and feelings become increasingly polarized. Perception becomes reality, and in extreme cases, moral boundaries may begin to blur. Allegedly, this is the environment in which Nick's decisions were made. A space where isolation, validation, and resentment converged. Nick's situation was further complicated by the presence of other family members. Romy, the youngest sibling, reportedly discovered the bodies after the tragedy. Her relationship with Nick was, by most accounts, protective but also distant. In the complex web of sibling dynamics, influence and oversight often overlap. Romy's role as both observer and reporter adds another layer of complication, highlighting how multiple interactions within a family can collectively shape outcomes. The day of the murders, according to reported accounts, was the culmination of years of internal tension and external influence. The precise timeline, the interactions, and the mental state of each family member remain subjects of investigation and speculation. But it is clear that Nick, living in the guest house and navigating a labyrinth of expectation, validation, and frustration, was at a critical emotional juncture. Understanding Nick requires acknowledging both his vulnerability and his capacity for action. He was not simply a passive recipient of influence. He was a human being, capable of making choices, yet operating within an environment that amplified certain thoughts and minimized alternatives. In psychological terms, this is the intersection of predisposition and environment, a space where influence can act as a powerful accelerant. And it was within this context that alleged conversations with Tracy and perhaps other family members became pivotal. Words that seemed casual or supportive may have been internalized as justification, permission, or even instruction. Allegedly, these interactions transformed perceived grievances into perceived imperatives, shaping a psychological environment that made the unthinkable conceivable. Public perception, however, remained focused on Nick as the perpetrator. Headlines emphasized his role, his proximity to the crime, and his legal culpability. The nuances of emotional influence, family dynamics, and psychological stress were largely ignored in the rush to simplify the narrative. Yet these nuances are essential for a full understanding of the tragedy. They illustrate that in families, particularly high-profile ones, responsibility is rarely singular and often extends beyond the individual who commits the act. As we continue to examine the Reiner family, it becomes increasingly evident that Nick's story cannot be isolated from the broader network of relationships and emotional currents that defined his life. His decisions, while ultimately his own, were shaped by decades of subtle manipulation, expectations, and unspoken resentments. To view the murders as a single, isolated event is to misunderstand the complexity of human behavior and the power of influence within families. Nick Reiner, the son everyone worried about, was at once vulnerable, pressured, and influentially guided. His story is not just about action. It is about context, environment, and the interplay of relationships that ultimately culminated in tragedy. And the next chapter will reveal the role of the guest house, not just as a physical space, but as a crucible of isolation, reflection, and alleged planning, where words and influence may have held as much power as any weapon. But what came next would expose just how far the isolation, the resentment, and the unspoken manipulations could reach. And no one could have predicted the depth of the consequences. The guest house. To most outsiders, it was just a secondary building on the Reiner estate, a place for guests to stay, a private living space for an adult child. Functional, convenient, and separate from the main household. But in the story of the Reiner family, this guest house was far more than brick and mortar. It was a psychological arena, a space that amplified vulnerability, magnified resentment, and arguably set the stage for a tragedy that would shock the world. Nick Reiner, living there at 32, was physically close to his parents yet emotionally distant in ways that no wall or door could contain. Every family has physical boundaries, but few boundaries are as symbolic as this one. The guest house was not just a home, it was a statement. It represented independence, certainly, but also exile. A constant reminder that while he was part of the family, he was also separated, marginalized, and under scrutiny from a distance. Psychologists often describe spaces like this as both safe and isolating. For someone struggling with emotional fragility, a guest house can feel like sanctuary, but it can also become a prison. Isolation intensifies reflection, magnifies grievances, and allows internal narratives to grow unchecked. Allegedly, this is precisely what happened with Nick. Alone with his thoughts, free from immediate oversight, and yet constantly aware of the family's expectations, he inhabited a psychological pressure cooker. In this space, influence operates differently. Words carry more weight, conversations linger longer, and internalizations have time to take root. Alleged reports suggest that Tracy and perhaps other family members would visit, communicate, and interact with Nick in ways that seemed benign on the surface but had profound psychological effects. A simple statement of understanding, "You've been treated unfairly," can resonate differently when spoken in a space that feels detached from the scrutiny of the main household. The physical structure of the guest house also reinforced its role as an emotional crucible. Separate entrances, enclosed courtyards, and visual distance from the main house created a sense of isolation. The layout provided privacy, but also a subtle reminder of separation. For someone like Nick, who reportedly felt misunderstood and marginalized, the environment amplified feelings of exclusion. He was both near and far, visible yet unseen, part of the family yet perpetually on the periphery. Living in isolation with reinforced grievances can have profound effects on cognition and decision-making. Allegedly, Nick's mindset became increasingly influenced by repeated affirmations of injustice. Subtle emotional nudges, reinforced in a space where he had both time and solitude to internalize them, may have intensified his perceptions of being wronged. Words repeated in private become more potent. They echo, reverberate, and embed themselves in thought patterns in ways that public conversations never can. It's also important to recognize the guest house as a space of reflection and rehearsal. Alone, Nick could replay interactions, analyze perceived slights, and mentally construct scenarios that escalated his anger. Isolation does not simply remove distractions. It provides room for obsessive thought, planning, and emotional amplification. Allegedly, in this environment, conversations with Tracy or others may have shifted from casual venting to reinforcement of extreme perspectives. Another layer of complexity is the psychological interplay between proximity and distance. Nick was close enough to hear the life of the main house, to sense approval, disappointment, or indifference, yet far enough away to feel powerless to influence outcomes. This paradox creates a heightened sensitivity to perceived injustices. Every action, omission, or comment from the main household can be magnified, misinterpreted, or internalized as intentional slight. In such a setting, emotional influence from someone attuned to these dynamics can be devastating. Reports suggest that Tracy may have understood this dynamic intimately. As an adopted daughter with her own nuanced understanding of family hierarchy, she allegedly knew which words to choose, when to speak, and how to reinforce Nick's perceptions without overtly commanding action. Influence in this form is subtle. It's psychological, relational, and sometimes invisible to anyone outside the immediate interaction. Yet its effects can be profound. The guest house was also a site of solitude, where Nick could process his emotions without interference. This freedom, however, had a dark side. It allowed negative thought patterns to fester. Resentment, fear, and frustration, emotions that might have been moderated by engagement with supportive family members, could grow unchecked. And when external affirmation, such as alleged guidance from Tracy, entered this space, it acted as a catalyst, validating and amplifying these emotions rather than moderating them. Consider, for a moment, the symbolism of living in a separate structure. The main house represented authority, oversight, and familial judgment. The guest house represented independence, yes, but also exile. For someone emotionally vulnerable, This duality is powerful. You are close enough to witness the world you wish to fully belong to, yet distant enough to feel the sting of exclusion at every turn. In this psychological landscape, even minor influences can have magnified consequences. Isolation also changes perception. In confined emotional spaces, individuals can fixate on slights, real or imagined. Cognitive biases intensify, creating narratives in which grievances appear larger, injustices more personal, and responses more justified. Allegedly, the guest house provided precisely this environment for Nick. The combination of physical separation, perceived marginalization, and repeated affirmation from a trusted family member created conditions where anger could escalate into action. It's worth noting that spaces like the guest house often serve as both sanctuary and trap. They offer privacy, freedom, and reflection, but they also remove opportunities for moderation, intervention, and perspective. For Nick, the environment may have allowed him to dwell on injustices, internalize emotional pressure, and consider options that would have been unimaginable in the public spaces of the main household. And yet, the guest house was not empty. Allegedly, interactions with Tracy, Romy, and possibly other family members occurred here. Conversations that were subtle, private, and emotionally charged. They may have been intended as support, but in the context of isolation and heightened emotional sensitivity, they acted as reinforcement. What begins as reassurance can become permission. What begins as venting can become justification. And what begins as emotional guidance can, in extreme circumstances, become a form of indirect manipulation. The psychology of isolation is clear. Humans are social creatures, and distance from communal interaction changes behavior. Emotional reinforcement, repeated affirmation, and validation in private spaces can have outsized effects. Words repeated, even casually, take on weight when heard in solitude. Allegedly, this is precisely what occurred in the guest house. The space itself may not have committed any crime, but it became the incubator for thoughts, feelings, and alleged manipulations that set the stage for a devastating event. From a broader perspective, the guest house represents a warning about the intersection of physical space and emotional vulnerability. It shows how separation, when combined with repeated emotional influence, can amplify grievances and contribute to extreme behavior. The architecture of a home is rarely neutral. It shapes interaction, perception, and emotional processing in ways that are often underestimated. As the story unfolds, the guest house emerges not just as a setting, but as a character in its own right, a silent witness to escalating tension, unspoken resentments, and alleged manipulations. It was within these walls that Nick's thoughts were shaped, reinforced, and potentially guided toward outcomes none of the family could have anticipated. And this is where the line between influence and responsibility becomes blurred. The guest house provided the environment in which words, emotions, and perceptions could interact without interference. Allegedly, this allowed Tracy's guidance to carry extraordinary weight. But how do we measure responsibility in a space where words, rather than actions, are the instruments of influence? We may never know the full truth. The guest house holds its secrets behind locked doors, quiet walls, and the absence of witnesses willing or able to testify. But its role is undeniable. It was the crucible where emotional currents converged, where vulnerability met influence, and where the stage was set for a tragedy that would ultimately shatter the Reiner family and capture public attention worldwide. As we move forward, the next chapter will reveal the nature of the conversations that allegedly took place within these walls. Conversations that seemed casual, supportive, or harmless, but which may have planted the seeds of catastrophe. Because what happened in the guest house didn't stay in the guest house. It spilled into the main house, into the family dynamic, and ultimately, into history. But what came next would escalate the tension beyond anything the family could have imagined, and no one could have predicted how far it would go. Words can be more powerful than weapons. In the Reiner household, according to alleged accounts, the conversations that took place over months, sometimes casual, sometimes intense, shaped a trajectory that would end in tragedy. These were not ordinary family talks about dinners, vacations, or work. These were charged, emotionally loaded dialogues that navigated resentment, expectation, loyalty, and subtle persuasion. The first thing to understand is the context. Nick, isolated in the guest house, was in a state of heightened sensitivity. He perceived slights that others might have dismissed, misinterpreted interactions, and felt under constant judgment. In such an emotional environment, the words spoken to him carried weight far beyond ordinary conversation. Allegedly, Tracy Reiner, aware of both his vulnerabilities and the family dynamics, used this to guide, and in some interpretations, manipulate, his thinking. Some conversations were reportedly framed as support. "I understand why you feel this way," or "they don't appreciate what you do for them." At first glance, these statements appear benign. They are empathetic, even caring. But repeated affirmations in a context where resentment is already simmering can act like fuel on a fire. Each comment subtly validated Nick's grievances, reinforcing his perception of injustice. Other conversations were more pointed. Allegedly, Tracy encouraged reflection on perceived inequalities within the family. She may have highlighted instances where she believed Nick had been unfairly treated, comparing his experiences to those of siblings or to the expectations of the parents. These comparisons, subtle as they might have seemed, reportedly emphasized a narrative in which Nick was not just wronged, but victimized. The framing of his grievances as systemic injustices transformed them from personal frustrations into perceived moral imperatives. Isolation magnified these effects. Alone in the guest house, Nick had time to internalize these messages, replay them, and integrate them into his worldview. Without immediate counterpoints from other family members or external perspectives, emotional reinforcement became the dominant narrative. The human brain, especially under stress or isolation, can overemphasize repeated messages, particularly when they affirm existing beliefs. Allegedly, this is what occurred with Nick. The conversations shaped a cognitive environment where extreme action became conceivable. It is also important to consider the psychological technique known as validation amplification. When someone repeatedly confirms another person's negative perceptions, it strengthens those perceptions and reduces the likelihood of questioning them. Allegedly, Tracy employed this, consciously or unconsciously. Each acknowledgement of Nick's frustration, each empathetic nod, potentially intensified his internal narrative. Validation, ordinarily a supportive tool, became a mechanism that reinforced grievance and, eventually, anger. Yet, the conversations were not merely affirmations. Allegedly, there were moments of subtle encouragement. "They don't understand you. You have to stand up for yourself." Or sometimes, "You have to take matters into your own hands to get respect." These are dangerous phrases in a psychologically charged environment. They do not command action directly, but they frame action as justified. In a mind already wrestling with perceived oppression, such framing can lower the moral threshold for extreme decisions. Emotional tone matters. Psychologists note that tone, cadence, and delivery can amplify the impact of words. A calm, empathetic voice suggesting, "You deserve better," can carry far more weight than an angry admonition. Allegedly, Tracy's style of communication struck this balance, sympathetic enough to feel personal, assertive enough to feel urgent. This combination, in isolation, may have acted as a psychological accelerant. Additionally, repetition is a critical factor. One conversation might have limited effect, but repeated interactions over weeks and months can entrench beliefs deeply. Allegedly, Tracy engaged in repeated dialogue with Nick, revisiting past slights, emphasizing perceived injustices, and encouraging reflection on how these patterns of treatment were unfair. Each session reinforced the narrative, creating a mental environment where grievance and moral justification intertwined. Family dynamics further complicated these interactions. Nick's siblings, parents, and extended relatives all played indirect roles. Silence can be as powerful as words. Allegedly, the lack of immediate intervention, the assumption that Nick was simply venting, and the perception that his feelings were being ignored or misunderstood created fertile ground for the influence of the conversations with Tracy. Emotional isolation, combined with validation from a trusted source, can profoundly shape behavior. In many high-profile family tragedies, investigators later note the role of private dialogue in influencing outcomes. Conversations, particularly those charged with emotion and repeated over time, often go unnoticed by outsiders but leave deep psychological marks. Allegedly, this was the case in the Reiner household. Each word, each carefully chosen phrase, added weight to Nick's internal narrative. It is said that these dialogues did not directly instruct action. They nudged, justified, and framed his worldview in ways that ultimately contributed to tragedy. But influence alone does not account for everything. Individual vulnerability, past experiences, and personality traits intersect with external factors to shape outcomes. Nick's alleged responses were not merely the product of conversation. They were the result of a complex interplay of internal and external pressures. The repeated dialogues acted as catalysts, but the fuel for the reaction was already present: feelings of exclusion, resentment, and a sense of injustice. The ethical implications of this dynamic are profound. How responsible is someone for the decisions of another if they repeatedly validate grievances, emphasize perceived injustices, and subtly encourage assertiveness? Legal systems focus on direct action, but morality and psychology paint a more nuanced picture. Allegedly, Tracy's deathbed confession, "I was the one who pushed him," reflects this recognition of indirect responsibility. It suggests an awareness that influence, though intangible, carries consequences. Moreover, the content of these conversations reportedly escalated over time. Initially framed as support and understanding, they may have evolved into discussions about accountability, fairness, and self-assertion. In isolation, with limited perspectives to counterbalance the narrative, such conversations can create a distorted reality in the mind of a vulnerable individual. Allegedly, this is precisely what occurred in the guest house. Words intended to comfort or guide may have inadvertently or intentionally guided Nick toward thinking that drastic measures were justified. The timing and context of these conversations are also crucial. Occurring in the weeks and months leading up to the tragedy, they created a psychological trajectory. Each interaction added another layer of reinforcement, another piece of justification, another imagined grievance confirmed. Allegedly, by the time the events of that fateful Sunday occurred, the cumulative weight of these dialogues had reached a tipping point. And yet, the conversations were never sinister on their face. To an outsider, they might appear as routine sibling support, empathy, or casual advice. The danger lies not in a single statement, but in the accumulation and timing, how repeated words interact with internal vulnerabilities, environmental stressors, and prior experiences. In this sense, the conversations themselves became instruments of influence, shaping decisions and perceptions without ever leaving a physical trace. Experts often refer to this phenomenon as emotional scaffolding, the process by which repeated validation, affirmation, and subtle suggestion provide a framework that shapes thought and action. Allegedly, the dialogues between Tracy and Nick functioned as such scaffolding. Each conversation built upon the previous, creating a mental and emotional architecture that may have contributed to the eventual decision to commit violence. Family members, even those observing from outside, may recognize the signs. Repeated grievances, heightened sensitivity, and private affirmations are often indicators that influence is being exerted. Yet, in most families, these patterns remain unnoticed or are dismissed as normal interpersonal dynamics. Only when tragedy occurs does the significance of such conversations become clear. The Reiner family tragedy illustrates a chilling reality. Words alone, carefully placed and repeated in the right context, can be as consequential as any action. Allegedly, the conversations in the guest house did more than comfort. They shaped perception, justified emotion, and set the stage for catastrophic behavior. And this is why Tracy's alleged deathbed confession is so significant. It acknowledges influence that cannot be measured by evidence, fingerprints, or eyewitness testimony, but which may have been as powerful as any overt action. "I was the one who pushed him," she allegedly said, a statement that reframes our understanding of responsibility, guilt, and the role of family dynamics in tragedy. As the narrative continues, we will explore how these conversations intersected with the events of the fateful day, how perceptions hardened into action, and how the culmination of years of subtle dialogue and emotional influence erupted into irreversible violence. Because the words spoken in private can have consequences that echo far beyond the rooms in which they were uttered. But what came next would show just how deadly the combination of isolation, influence, and grievance could become. And no one saw the final act coming. Tension in families is inevitable. Disagreements, rivalries, misunderstandings, they are part of the human experience. But in the Reiner household, tension had been quietly accumulating for years, hidden beneath polished appearances, smiles, and the veneer of a perfect family. By the weeks leading up to the tragedy, the tension had reached a level that no amount of wealth, privilege, or public admiration could contain. Nick Reiner, isolated in the guest house, was navigating a volatile emotional landscape. He was close enough to witness the life of the main household, yet far enough to feel disconnected, marginalized, and misunderstood. This physical separation mirrored his emotional distance, creating a crucible in which frustration and resentment could intensify without check. Allegedly, he was also under the repeated influence of Tracy Reiner, whose words, careful, empathetic, yet subtly guiding, reinforced grievances and validated his anger. Every family has flashpoints, moments when long-simmering tension threatens to boil over. For the Reiners, those moments may have been subtle, a dismissive glance, a perceived slight during conversation, or the casual indifference of parents busy with high-profile obligations. Small incidents, often insignificant to an outsider, can become catalysts when layered upon years of accumulated resentment. Allegedly, Nick experienced these flashpoints repeatedly, each one adding another brick to an emotional wall separating him from reason, empathy, and restraint. Isolation amplified everything. The guest house was not merely a living space, it was a psychological pressure chamber. Alone with his thoughts, Nick could dwell on slights, ruminate on injustices, and rehearse imagined confrontations. Allegedly, conversations with Tracy, occurring in this isolated environment, acted as accelerants, subtly framing these grievances as morally justified and even necessary to confront. Words that might have been harmless in a public space became charged with weight in the quiet solitude of the guest house.